This is an evaluation question, and the question asks about what would be useful to compare between these 2 years in order to evaluate the argument. The conclusion is that over these 4 decades, the proportion of women voting in national elections has increased. The missing link is between all the information presented in the argument and the conclusion that over these 4 decades, the proportion of women voting in national elections has increased. Our broad expectation from the correct answer choice is that it should compare 1950 and 1990 on a factor that would suggest whether the proportion of women voting in national elections has increased over the last 4 decades. Before we move on to the answer choices, a thing that one must note is that the argument talks about 1950 and 1990 and provides information about the percentage of women who voted in these elections, which is 20% in 1950 and 40% in 1990. So this piece of information related to the percentage of women talks about voting women among all women, whereas the conclusion is about the proportion of women voting. So the conclusion is about voting women among all voters. So there is a gap in the information presented in the argument and the conclusion. So this gap must be adequately filled in order for the conclusion to hold. In other words, we need to know the proportion of men who are voting in national election in order to evaluate the argument. In this context, let's look at the answer choices. Answer choice A, the argument mentions that in 1950 and in 1990, certain percentage of women voted. Based on this percentage, which is 20% in 1950 and 40% in 1990, the percentage of women who did not vote can be calculated. So, information about the percentage of women who did not vote in national elections, this information can be directly derived from the argument, and this comparison is not going to yield any new information. Also, this answer choice does not talk about the percentage or proportion of men voting, and hence no inference can be drawn about the proportion of women voting among all voters. So let's eliminate this answer choice. Answer choice B, the argument mentions that over the last 4 decades, the proportion of women voting in national elections has increased. This conclusion talks about the proportion of voting women among all voters. However, the argument makes no suggestion regarding the men who are voting. So this piece of information, that is the proportion of women voting, has increased. For this conclusion to hold, we need to know the proportion of men as well, which is what is mentioned in answer choice B. In other words, comparing the percentage of men who voted in national elections in 1950 and in 1990, based on this comparison, we can evaluate the argument regarding whether over the last 4 years there has been an increase in the proportion of women voting in national elections. So this answer choice needs to be evaluated for the conclusion to hold. A good answer choice, let's keep this on hold. Answer choice C, the argument is concerned with the proportion of women voting, whether any women actually went on to hold a government office after winning an election is out of scope. Also, the conclusion is about the proportion of women voting, and we need to know the proportion of men voting in order to evaluate the conclusion that the proportion of women voting has increased. So this answer choice does not indicate the required comparison. Let's eliminate this answer choice. Answer choice D, the argument is concerned with the proportion of women voting in national elections. Whether the women voted in more than one national election, this piece of information is just additional information and makes no suggestion regarding whether the proportion of women voting in national elections has increased. Also, for the conclusion to hold, we need to know the proportion of men voting in national elections. This answer choice makes no suggestion on that line. So let's eliminate this answer choice. Answer choice E, the argument is concerned with national elections. So local elections are out of scope. So let's eliminate this answer choice. B is the correct answer choice.